Ghanaian design thinker, educator, and writer whose work sits at the intersection of decolonial theory, African philosophy, and decolonized design. He is a lecturer in communication design at RMIT University in Melbourne. His scholarship examines how design, technology, and education reproduce or resist colonial power, with a particular interest in African epistemologies, disability inclusive climate resilience, and the politics of environmental time. Yao is the author of Decolonizing Design in Africa and African Design Futures. His research and essays appear in international journals and educated collections. His creative and research practice blends storytelling, pedagogy, and design to reimagine futures beyond extractive systems, working closely with communities in Australia and Ghana on projects that span youth climate education and accessible safe space design for people with disabilities. Across teaching, research, and public writing, Yao is committed to building plural, relational, and justice-oriented design cultures grounded in African thought and lived experience. Thank you much. Thank you very much, Dr. Ofosu-Asare, for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Amazing, for that amazing introduction. I wanted to do that. So thank you so much. And welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today, and it's humbling to be in the midst of such scholarship. And I did a bit of snooping around and Googled everyone on the panel just to see. So it's very humbling to be here. As here in Australia, they will say early career researcher. As a young man who's starting to build his own, find his path and build his own. So it's a pleasure. So today I'll be talking about the topic I'll be talking about is from colonization to African future. So looking into decolonizing philosophy, education, and design, how those interchange or mix together. So I like to talk. I want to introduce myself first. So my journey in design was one of it. I remember being 9 years and then around the early 2000s and having the first computer presented by the headmistress of our primary school. And it was a public school and we all lined up like a morning assembly, as we call it. And then this one big desktop was just placed in front of us and the headmistress was presenting the first computer. And then it was like, and I was like, wow, look at this. And I remember going home and telling my dad, and my dad saying they also had one, but like it's supposed to be only placed in an air conditioning room because apparently it can never be any other room that's an air conditioning room. So that really stuck with me. So it's something growing up with computers have always been something I've always been intrigued and wanted to work on. So I guess it wasn't any surprise that when I decided to go to uni, I did graphic design, which really then gave me the opportunity to do a lot of computer design. So did a lot of Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign, and that really began. So that's the first part of my entry into design. And the second part is where I grew up. So I grew up growing up in Ghana in the 90s. If people here remember, the 90s was a time of the IMF and liberal economics and stuff. So the country opens up. I guess I was born, there's new media, new radio, there's freedom, there's more. So that offers my parent the opportunity to give me the sort of education I get, the sort of information, the sort of having one computer presented to us. And then growing up on the coast of the western side of Ghana, where it's the coastline. You see all those colonial architecture building in Sekondi, in Cape Coast, in Elmina, and then going to visit my mom at the market and seeing all those colors, just the colors, the fabric colors and everything, just shaping that really then grounds me in where what the work I'm doing now. So that's basically the foundation. So those three things: the opening up of the economy, liberalization, parents having the resources to give me the sort of education I get, me having the exposure of growing up in a place where you could see modern contemporary Ghana at the backdrop of colonial Ghana, at the same time having the market scene and money and how goods and stuff are actually. So I'm seeing all those things as a kid. And then I come, I do my bachelor's in Ghana, do a master's in Ghana at Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology. And then I decided to come to Australia. I choose Australia because of the language. I was like, I'm not going to learn anyone's language. I'm not going to Europe to learn German or Scandi. I just want a place, come do my PhD and not have to worry about any language because I did French for 3 years in school and I can't speak a word of French. So I'm not good at French. So I'm not going to do this. So I come here and then that's where I start really thinking deeply about all these the questions I ask now, the questions I have in my work now. So as a kid, I was a normal kid always growing up. People always have my name is very people always ask you, what is your English name? Like anytime I start a new class and the teacher asks everybody of their names and I raise up my hand, tell your name, Yao. Ofosu-Asare. Do you have an English name? No. Everybody looks surprised. It's something you never as a kid, I never thought. I remember I even asking my dad, "Do I have an English name?" He's like, "Why do you need an English name?" And then that becomes the foundation of my thesis. So the first chapter of my thesis, I start thinking about these things. Why do people even think about? Why is this something? Why is it even a question to ask? Like as an African, why do I need an English name? Why do I have to worry about an English name? So that begins my journey into understanding myself. So I then think about people always trying to find a meaning behind the name. So growing up, like being asked, and then I started reading more on Fanon. So I started reading Frank Fanon, and it really then unpacks the psychological layer and why people are asking these questions. So it begins my journey with decolonization. So the point of decolonization is not just about the changing of flags, rewriting textbooks. It becomes the continuing lived and embodied experience of how we are trained to measure ourselves with someone else ruler and then calling the ruler neutral. So I this is where I want to start the presentation. I'm not here to talk about adding Africa to anything in the context of design. I'm more talking about the translation and how and what get lost when the translation becomes a price of legitimacy. So I'm trying to paint a picture from how I grew up, how my name then starts me questioning myself and my identity and why do I need an English name? You're reading Fanon, reading Kwesi Radio. I'm like, oh, I have so much work to do. I have so much reading to do. Like, I'm not just this person. I'm a construct of a long history of colonialism, long history of violence. And this is me trying to understand all these things. So, and then fortunate for me, get to, I teach at RMIT University in Melbourne here. And I've already talked about, I studied visual arts in Ghana, and then while studying visual, like I never came across anything called African design philosophy or anything or in design. Any introduction of Africanness in the design curriculum, so it was just they did a Adinkra symbol people paste on their work just to Africanize it. It's just the kente print people put on their dress and they're like, oh, it looks African. It became an inspiration. And so we never talk about the theories of form, the history of modernity, the standards of professionalism, and the unspoken definition of what is good design and how we treat good design. And then even in my teaching, when I ask students to research good design, they return with the Bauhaus, the Swiss style, the brand identity. They look at Apple, Nike, European luxury houses. And then we forget about the entire methodology, that what counts as evidence, what counts as rigor, what counts as successful outcome. So it's structured. So they think about all these things are structured by epistemologies presented as universal, but in fact, it's not universal. Like these are not, well, everybody looks at form and design and layout as. So just to this talk this talk sits between those problems, and I'm not here to rehearse what's the decolonial canon. A lot of people have written about it. Mingoli, Mignoli, Mbembe, Kwesi Redu, they've all, and I'm just here to I'm just like, and this room is full of Africans, so I'm just here to. I'm not trying to convince Africans about how harmful colonization is. It's we already know. We lived it. It's in our bodies. It's in the institutions we know. So the question what I'll be presenting. Just trying to change my slide. It's not working. Yeah, yeah. So what I'll be presenting today, the question I'll be presenting on is what does it look like to decolonize at the level of method, not only at the level of content? What changes when we stop treating African thought as decorative material and start treating it as a way of reasoning, evaluating, designing futures? So uh, also a bit of the before a bit of the my publication. So I've published two books, which the first one is Decolonizing Design in Africa. The second one is African Design Futures. And then this is my thesis, which it's on stories of a post-colonial space, which I looked at writing different stories of growing up, like the spaces I grew up in, and then looking and trying to find all those points where. So an example would be when we go to school in Ghana, you're supposed to speak only English, and if you speak any local language, you're punished. So trying to tell all those stories and trying to understand it from my perspective, and then filtering it through the interviews I did. So and also I've just published a novel which looks into a point of view aspect of a man growing up in like the early 2000s in Ghana, and how like how life is structured. Him growing up and never really feeling the breathing and surviving in like in poverty, and never getting to like, never becoming successful, and just that painful existence where you grow up very poor and never get to. So it's the new book I just published a few months ago. So the question I come back, so what does it look like to decolonize at the level of method and not just content? So to treat African thought as a way of reasoning, evaluating, and thinking about designing the future. So why the question some people asking is why design? How did you find your way into design? So design education matters because design is a training ground for legitimacy. It teaches what counts as evidence, what counts as clarity, what counts as good taste, what counts as professional voice. Design is not neutral because it sits at the boundary between knowledge and the world. Design turns ideas into forms that people live with, a curriculum template, a policy infographic, a brand identity for a ministry, a wayfinding system in the hospital. I always get so lost at the big malls. I have to take a picture of where I parked my car, where I walked. So because it's all these things are things people are making decisions, like the wayfinding system in the malls, and an interface that decide who get to be seen or who get to delay. So when the design curriculum inherits imported defaults and leaves them unexamined, design becomes a soft technology of governance. So design becomes a way we govern our life. It calibrates people into the global visual and behavioral order, and that order usually has a center. So you can see that in a graphic design curricula, when design history start from Bauhaus or the Swiss typography at the center of it. And when Edinkra in CBD, Kente logics and carves tools and mocks geometric textiles, signs, and are treated as just culture flavors, just motifs. You can see when African design is referenced in printmaking or textiles as motif, but not as theory. When we look at design system, not as a system, not the Dinkra, Kente, not as a system of reasoning about form, relation, ethics, and meaning. You can also see you can also see it in methods. Students are often trained into research about persona template, journey maps, user needs, statements, time-bound ideation sprints, and all, all they think about is not they don't think about it in a very relational way. So not a relation. They don't think about the person they are designing for in a very relation. They just think about the individual, that one person they are designing. They don't think about how the person is embedded in their family systems, in their community, obligation, informal care. What about their spiritual life? Those don't and what about the time, the non-linear ways of time, how people perceive time, how different cultures understand time. And even the critique, even how we critique design work as good design is a work that looks globally legible, not the work that is locally accountable. So the strongest student learns to perform what the room unconsciously calls professionalism, which often means neutrality, minimalism, and Euro-American presentation style. And one thing, and yes, you can see that, and you can see this visibly in in a typical African city. So you see a lot of imported defaults about progress. When glass, you have all these glass buildings, all these people trying to build like using trying to use materials which are not locally sourced. And you could see office blocks that copied like it's copied from temperate climate modernism and then made livable with constant air conditioning. So there's so many air conditioning, and we are not building for who we are in the context of Africa. And even in places where courtyard, shade, veranda, cross logics already, you could see we are moving away from the shared communal way of living. The typical Ashanti indigenous house had a courtyard where everybody will see everybody. You get out, you see your friend, your family, you always have a meeting point. But now you're all moving away to in chasing what we describe modernism as. So when you see it in housing estates are designed around nuclear family and indoor life, with rigid room division in a context where cooking, hosting, child rearing, collective care often spill outward and depend on flexible shared thresholds. You see it when master plan development of gated compounds treat security as separation, where older urban residents relied on eyes on the street, while older urban residents relied on eyes on the street, shared edges, and social familiarity. None of this is about rejecting. I'm not talking about rejecting the global. Rejecting it's more about noticing when the global becomes the hidden ruler and African ways of living are forced to translate themselves just to count. So how did we, I guess the question is, how did we get here? How did design education like, so if you think of design get introduced into the curriculum through the missionary schools. So it becomes a craft. They start like calling it craft. And then the first university starts springing up in Africa. And then they start developing their design curriculum, and then it still sits in the craft. So what a lot of the design works we do in Africa is either termed as craft or art. There's no really a lot of conversation about even when design is used, mostly used in the context of fashion, where a lot of African is just everything becomes fashion design. It's not really we don't really separate. It also becomes a language thing where a lot of languages don't have the specific word design. So we need to use what the English define design as to then define what we also think about it, what we also think design is. So in terms of education, so after and this right after independence, many African countries inherited school system still patterned by global values. So this an example in Ghana is when right after independence we adopted the English. So it's from the first post-independent administration from 57 to 66 adopted the English only policy, and which was from a Bernard Committee minority report was taken up. But and this has been over the years, we've tried and tested how to bring in those local languages, how to really teach, run the education system in different local languages. So in Ghana, I think in examples we do, English becomes the main language. you pick one language from your locality. So I mean, growing up speaking in Takada, I'll do Fanti. Someone growing in Accra will do Ga or Tree. So it's always it's something we've been trying to play. Like decolonizing the education system is something we've always been trying over and over the years to really see how an education system will fit and mold an African. Even the examination system, the West African exam architecture follows pretty much in their policy document talks about how it's supposed to represent the standards of the United Kingdom. So the colonial infrastructure, the WAEC own history states that one of its objectives was to award certificate that did not represent lower standards than equivalent certificates given in the United Kingdom. So let's also note that early tuition and instruction follows syllabus developed along UK educational structures, and the WAEC acted as an agent for the University of London GCE ordinary advanced O levels and Cambridge certificates. So these are the paradoxes and the tensions we are dealing with in the education system. So why is this still happening? So part of this is credentialism, where families want qualification that travel because the labor market is unequal and mobility is survival. Part of it is language politics. In multilingual state, choosing one language can feel like choosing one people, and choosing another can feel like betrayal. Part of it is also in institutional inertia. Exams, teachers, training, textbooks, administrative systems are hard to rebuild, even harder to rebuild under economic pressure, which is the African story. Everything is you need to think about everything also in a very socio-economic context. So, and part of it is the psychology of colonial schooling trained many of us to experience international as neutral and local as too risky. So, but as I mentioned earlier, Ghana has repeatedly reintroduced mother tongue instruction in early years. Tanzania also has Tanzania Education of Self-Reliance in 67 tried to bind education to communal life. Guinea has also experimented with national language as media of instruction. So these are efforts being made, but the deeper issue is this: the architecture of the colonial schooling has really been dismantled, and we've just been repainting it, renaming it, and it's still been left standing. So what does this all matter? So one person I really look into and really read their work to get and an understanding of what I'm doing is Kwesi Radio. So one response, so one response about design education being inclusive is when people add some examples will be like add an African case study, add a week on Edinkra, celebrate Kente, invite a guest speaker to talk about African visual culture. So these are some of the things people just easily like, oh, why don't you just add a bit of African case study there? We can do a bit of Edinkra pattern. You can just celebrate Kente and invite the African person to come and speak or indigenous person to come and speak, then that's how we fill the quota of decolonization. It does matter. It's a step. I guess it's a step in the right direction, but it's always not enough. So inclusion can leave the underlying methodology untouched. So the template of research, the model of the user, the standard of professionalism, the definition of evidence, the hidden hierarchy of what counts as theory, those things stay in place. So this is where Kwesi Redu works really, really speaks to the work I do. So Redu gives a very clean example of how epistemic absence can exist inside physical presence. So in his essay towards decolonizing African philosophy and religion, he recalls finishing, because he tells the story of finishing the University of Ghana in 1958 and not having to hear anything about African philosophy. No, similar to my story, not having to learn anything about African philosophy, talk about African philosophy. And then this was just right after independence. And he says that it's all in that time, not a single word of African philosophy was said to him in his university. So that sentence becomes a map of legitimacy. So it tells us that the curriculum can be physically located in Africa and still operate epistem that word I need to elsewhere. It can also you have a curriculum in Accra, Lagos, Nairobi, Johannesburg, and it still be run on imported default about what counts as knowledge. So Redu carefully is careful about another trap. He resists the idea of proverbs, myth, symbols, communal sayings automatically equaling philosophy in the full sense. There, he looks at them as resources for philosophizing, conceptual material that can be that carry insight. They must be subjected to critical clarification and argument. In other words, culture does not do the thinking for you. Thinking still needs to happen. So the distinction matters for design education. So because when Edinkra becomes the logo style and not the conceptual resource, we stay in the motif trap. So when Edinkra becomes a way of thinking about relation, times, ethics, personhood, but we need Edinkra to become a way of thinking about relation, time, personhood, memory, governance, and accountability. Then we are not just including culture, we are changing the method. So what Redu's philosophy reveals is that it's the same problem we see in design education in African cities today. Institutions can be located in Africa, but while operating within models of the human, of time and value that comes from elsewhere. So in this, I developed five, five diagnostic questions that really sit as the foundation of the work I do. So the first question I always ask is, when we teach methods as neutral, what world are they collaborated for? So like, an example is in graphic design or experience design, students are often trained to research through persona templates, journey map, user needs statement, time bounds, ideation sprint. These tools are useful, but they often assume an autonomous individual consumer who can act without take ties, who can choose freely, who can predict time, stable literacy, and access to service. So that model clashes with how many African lives are organized. So relational personhood, extended family obligation, communal care, informal economics, layered authority, spiritual worth, and and the reality of the user is often a network, not a single body. So the diagnostic question, the diagnostic is simple. When your method assumes that the user is a self-contained individual, what kinds of reality becomes visible? So if you build a health communication campaign, assuming the individual reads, decide, and acts alone, you will miss the social and ethical infrastructure that actually moves the behavior, the elders, the aunties, the youth leaders, the religious communities, and the WhatsApp group, the markets association, the mutual aid, and the informal care. So you miss all those things if you just assume that you don't assume the person is a normative person, because the African defines a person as being normative. You don't become a person to the community acknowledges that you are a person. But then it clashes with the West, which is very individualistic. You're just a person. You are dualist. You're just a person because you are born. And the second question I ask is, what do our, I need to be moving the slides. Yeah. So the second question I ask is, what do our education systems, like what do our education systems still reward and what do they quietly punish? So we reward global legibility, reward a specific kind of clarity, often coded as neutrality, minimalism, Euro-American presentation style. We punish other forms of intelligence by calling them messy, informal, vernacular. So the use of language here is very how we use language to define what becomes messy, what becomes informal, what becomes vernacular, what becomes professional, or what is not professional enough. You see this in the language policy where English dominates because exams and employment are in English. And even when policy gestures towards local language, you see it in exam system built around external comparability. And you see it in design critique too, where the best work is often the work that looks internationally familiar. So the diagnostic is, are we rewarding rigor or we are rewarding resemblance? And we should be honest, when about a psychological cost, many of us have learned to survive by performing what the institution recognize. There's a moment where you realize you are not simply choosing an aesthetics, you're choosing legibility, safety, and professional belonging. And the third question is when we say critical thinking, what model of the human does the phrase assume? So critical thinking is, people say it a lot, it's often taught as the performance of individual independence, detached from the community, detached from emotion, detached from obligation, and it become a relational critique standing outside the world. But African philosophy resources frequently offer another model, a relational self where responsibility is not an optional add-on, but a condition of being. Like an example, I do not mean this is like examples like not saying Ubuntu, like just using Ubuntu as a slogan, everything, but meaning it, meaning Ubuntu, shifting Ubuntu as what counts as knowledge and what counts as ethics. So if personhood is relational, so going back, Ubuntu can be an economic policy, economic way. Like how do we theorize it? It becomes an actual method, you, not just the slogan we keep talking about. You just slogan like it's Ubuntu, but like how does it shape the social economic life of Africans? How does it sit in the classroom? How do you implement an Ubuntu in your classroom? How do you bring it as part? How does it form part of the design practice? I like the design education and the practice I do. So if personhood is relational, then design responsibility changes, collaboration changes, consent changes, accountability changes, and even authorship. Who's the author of the work? So the point of education also entirely changes because the goal is not the clever individuals. The goal has never been you, the individual. The African doesn't really think about you, the person, as the individual. It is a responsible you are a responsible participant in the living world. So here the design education link is our assessment rubrics often reward individual originality, individual voice, even in contexts where knowledge is communal and where wisdom is demonstrated through relational care. So the question becomes, how do we design assessment that can recognize relational intelligence, not just the individual brilliance? And the fourth question is, when we use African symbols, what are we using them as decoration or we are using them as theory? Here, like this, I also want to, going back to Redu, distinction, connecting Redu's distinction to design practice. If proverb symbols are resources for philosophizing, they can also be resources for designing, not as surface motifs, but as conceptual framework. So, for example, when a symbol encodes a claim about reciprocity, dignity, or collective flourishing, the design question is not, how do I make this look African? The question becomes, what does this concept teach about how to organize information, how to stage attention, how to present responsibility, how to make meaning public? This is this is where many curriculum fail students. They invite students to borrow patterns but not inherit the concept. In my own education, African design often entered the classroom through printmaking and textiles as motifs to decorate modern layout. But we never looked into the deeper logics were rarely taught as intellectual systems. The absence have consequences. It trains designers to see their own world as content, not just as method. And the final question is, how do we build futures that are rooted without becoming close, open, or without becoming dependent? So the goal is not about purity. So this conversation doesn't have to end saying we need to Africanize it. We can. It's not about it's not about a romantic return to, because in as much as we talk about decolonizing, there's obvious issues with indigenous knowledge systems, there's patriarchal issues, there's gender issues. So it's not about a romantic return to the past where you're thinking about this quickly going back and to pre-colonial era. It's more of cognitive justice. It's the possibility that multiple knowledge systems can coexist without one being forced to translate itself into the other just to be seen. So in design terms, can we design futures where African epistemologies do not appear only as local flavor or as legitimate ways of, but as legitimate ways of defining problems, making decisions, and evaluating sources? So this is also a question about time. Many imported development narratives assume a singular linear timeline tradition where modernity then progress. African philosophies philosophy has long challenged that simplification. The warning for design is when your timeline is imported, your future is already decided for you. So in my practice, I've been running two courses. I've developed two courses this semester. So the first one I co-developed with Rebecca Nally. She's a colleague of mine at RMIT. So it's the first course is storytelling. Okay. So the first course is storytelling as a method in graphic design. So it's a second year storytelling studio, and we just finished writing it. So the premise is simple. Stories are treated as design artifact, not just as illustrative content. So students do close reading. So from just off of the top of my head, the stories we picked were The Marriage of Anansiwa, Nas, the rapper Nas, New York State of Mind, Kokoro Ntumi, a movie, a David Donto, a Ghanaian movie, and a couple of, and should have written this down, a couple of indigenous Australian stories, a comedy, stand-up comedy. So it's such a diverse poetry, so a diverse range of stories where the student would then sit with, do close reading and think about how those stories operate in different knowledge systems, and for them to then decide, make graphic decisions through. So the typography, the layout, the pacing, hierarchy, the sequencing, they learn to treat the rhythm, the structure, the voice, and the silence and the relation accountability as design cues. We're also very careful with the language you use. We don't use languages like stakeholders, and because it just feels like it's such an extractive. So the careful use, there's a lot of linguistic people here, so the careful use of language, trying to really make sure the student understand the power of the language they use in their work, and really making sure they are careful in terms of and reading and understanding how language is used in different contexts also, and then coming up with using all these things. And then so this is pretty much a small way of decoloniality real inside workshop, not by adding the thing, but like changing. So the decolonization is pretty much the method in the teaching. And the second course, which also exists in this decolonizing framework, is experimental experience design. And so this is a course I wrote myself. So in the studio, so this is like a course for pretty much 200 students. So what will happen? So they're going to treat the campus. So RMIT is a camp. It's a university in the middle of the central business district of Melbourne. So they're going to treat the campus as a Martian colony. So they're going to think about how the camp, and then they're going to think about their positionality on Mars. So are they original Martians? Did they come from somewhere? Are they visiting Martians? And then there's also a bit of tension where there are new Earth people coming on Mars. So there's a lot of migration from Earth to Mars. And now the people on Mars are already complaining about how many people are coming from Earth. So they need to understand. So that the Martians now are calling for independence from Earth. So they need to understand. So through that, the students are able to think about what sort of position they play in those contexts, and how does that shape their understanding of the world, and also thinking about how Mars presents a unique, different way of designing. So where color is different because the atmosphere is different. You're not ready. You need to if you're developing posters, you're not going to use the same colors as the ones on Earth. So thinking about all these things and running experiments. So they have to do two experiments as their first assignment, and the last. So then after the experiment, then they move into developing systems based on their positionality and really understanding what role they play, and then having and getting those understanding, trying to build a civic system, build a system that based on their positionality and having to design like a whole design system on Mars. So those are the two courses. There's another course next semester which is industry partnered branding, which we'll be using, which is getting a lot of community based organization here in Melbourne. And then later on, the idea is to take it. The idea is also bringing organizations from other part of the world and getting the student to really work with these organizations and develop brand guides and help them understand it's not just about it's like how communities says it, how different communities and how to design for these communities. So it's this will be the end of the presentation, and then yeah, so that's thank you and thank you so much. So if anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ofosu-Asare, for such an insightful conversation about design. Professor Makoni, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for this. I have a couple of minor queries and compliments that I want to write. I like the way, for example, you were able to use and talk about the work of Kwesi, Wiredu, and design. Because I think the philosophical mistake some of the decolonial work runs into is to simply, I'm sort of dramatizing this thing a bit, is simply say, or because I've quoted and cited Minolo, that's the end of the story. When there are a lot of these other African philosophers, African decolonial scholars like Wiredu, Yanka, and all those guys, whose work in actual fact has influenced some of the work that is done by people like Lewis Gordon in the United States. So I really like that part. And the use of Wiredu and all that, what it does for me, it echoes something that I've wanted to do. I've always been trying to work on. And a couple of semesters ago, we tried to start on that with Mama Adobia to get some of the linguists, for example, African linguists we've done a lot of excellent work, but their voices are completely erased in modern linguistic work. People like, for example, Florence Dolphin, who was the first Ghanaian female professor. And when we were in Ghana, I think she literally taught everything from morphology, phonology to everything. And she has had a major impact, not so much through her writing, but through the many different people that she taught who went through there. So let me leave that for the time being. I'm just happy that you are moving in that direction. At the very beginning of your talk, you showed us one of the books that you wrote on, I think it was your dissertation on Sankofa. Can you tell us a bit more what exactly is included in that particular dissertation? How were you using Sankofa? What did you understand by it?
Thank you, and thank you so much for the first bit and the question. It's Sankofa became a term where I used it's my PhD thesis, and the Sankofa became a term where was a memory thing. So going back, and so it became two things. One of memory of my own memories as a child growing up, going back, thinking about it. The second was the understanding pre-colonial African knowledge systems and seeing how those can be reflected through education and design education, trying to pick on not just using like stories from like stories and Crafts. So, but I guess maybe we should define what Sankofa is. So Sankofa is part of the Dinkra system, and it's a bird looking backwards. So it's saying it's not. It's good to look. It's always good to go back and look at the past, and then use those to then define your present or the future. So it became it's the foundational theory that sits in the work, where the method I use is like always trying to look at memory as
Yes.
the Sankofa becomes the method of memory, and also pre-colonial thinking about pre-colonial African system, and then seeing how those reflect into the education practice we have now and the future.
So am I right to say that in your work, method is philosophy?
Yeah. Yeah, I
Oh,
think that's where I am heading towards.
okay. Now, that leads me to the discussion that you talked a bit about. It was interesting because you were talking about proverbs as resources. I wasn't very sure where you were landing in terms of the use of proverbs in African philosophy. What exactly is the core of the argument there?
So this is the core of African philosophy argument in terms of
Okay.
how do you define African philosophy?
Uh-huh.
It's a proverb philosophy. It's a
Uh-huh.
stories we tell philosophy, and then in Kwesi Redu then. So this is something I picked up from Kwesi Redu. He then says those are not necessary. Some philosophers say it's philosophy, proverbs,
Yes.
aphorisms. But then
Mm.
he says they are resources in philosophizing. So when you
Okay.
pick them, you use them as resources to then have a deeper conversation about philosophy, rather than using it as a standalone argument to then counter and say,
Oh,
Africa,
okay.
because we have proverbs, it becomes philosophy.
Okay. So in this case, proverbs are resources that you may mobilize to make an argument, something
Yeah.
like that. Now,
Yeah,
my question,
philosophical.
my
Yeah.
question is this: how then do you articulate your philosophical argument in cases where there are conflicting proverbs? There must be, in this pluriversality world, there must be proverbs for both positive and negative things. So how does African philosophy handle situations like that?
I think that's pretty much the answer. So this is where the philosophy comes from. So having those tensions and so these are, you've picked two resources, you've picked two proverbs, and now
Mhm.
you are using them as resources to then philosophize, and then that
Okay.
becomes, yeah. So that's where the critical thinking comes in. It's not just picking the proverbs and using them as a standalone argument and saying
Uh-huh.
this proverb talks about this thing, so it's not. So, but like picking those things and saying, this is a proverb, this is another proverb. Where, how do the resources, I guess, still goes back to those things.
Okay. And then the other issue that you raised, and you managed to provide um, a diction, meta language for me that I never had, I didn't have, which was as succinct as you put it. The idea of analytical resemblance and rigor, and that African scholars may opt more at times for resemblance, right, to make their scholarship legible to the West, so to speak, to the North, rather than rigor. I thought that was a very interesting way of thinking about this, that the dilemma that African scholars face at times is they may end up opting more for resemblance rather than and if that argument is valid, how have you tried to resolve this, what I would call the two-ara problem, resemblance on the one hand and rigor on the other? How have you resolved these two-ara problems in design?
I it's a tension I deal with every day. It's something I personally reflect on. It's something I'm always conscious about. Am I performing? Is this me? Am I doing this because it has to be legible? Is this African? Does the African have to, just because decolonized, should I not use Helvetica font? Should I use an African font? So this is something, it's a tension I see very visible in my work, in my way of life, even the way I dress, the way I do things. So I wouldn't say I've resolved it. It's an ongoing thing where I think it's something I don't think, does it need resolving?
Yes, yes, yes. But being
Does
aware
it?
of it, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
being aware and then also consciously making effort. And then, yeah, so I guess for me, the question is who
Who am I?
should the African cosplay Africanness, or we
Yes.
should be open to West and be adaptive and have a hybrid system? Because
Okay.
I think a lot of people expect you to behave a certain way
Yes.
so that you can be an African. Even
Uh-huh.
like your being black or your accent is not even enough.
Mhm.
You have to dress a certain way. You have to do a certain font. Yesterday, I had a meeting with a colleague, and then we were
Mhm.
talking about font typography. I don't think a lot of
Mhm.
people get excited when they talk about font. And I was like, my favorite font is Helvetica, and it's like, oh,
Mhm.
but you do decolonization. Why do you like a Swiss style font?
Mhm.
And I'm like, just because I do decolonize doesn't mean I have to perform to pick what you think should look African.
Mhm.
I should be
Mhm.
able to still pick that and then have it perform for my way of being an African. I shouldn't. Why am I excluded from being part of the global system and also not
Mhm.
be accepted as African? So I guess it's a tension there, which I probably will never resolve in my life, but I'm happy to
Mhm.
sit with it and move on.
Okay. My last question, then I'll hand over back to Amazing, who's doing an amazing work. Um, you begin by talking of your childhood, your mother is a seamstress and all that.
Mm,
And you also pointed out how human beings in African context are relational. Now, as you continue with your career, right, how is
yeah.
your how is your mother's understanding of you as a scholar, as an individual child that she gave birth to? How is that relationship um, unfolded? How is it grown? Mhm.
Uh yes, yeah, I guess they'll probably watch this because they always watch the
They
presentations
always
I
watch what
give.
you do. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, they do. And I think maybe, to be honest, I still don't drink alcohol at home. So I
Uh-huh.
guess the relationship still count. It's a mother-son
The
relationship.
mother-son relationship.
It's
Mm.
a it's a relationship still that treat, I guess, like, as an African, still treat you as the child. It still treat
Yes,
you as, yeah, you are not your own person. We still need to advise you. You can't
yes,
just I can't just not answer your phone when we call you twice.
yes, yes, yes.
Yeah.
Mm.
So
That's
by
interesting.
yeah,
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. My understanding of the dynamics of my own relationship in my own career and
Mm,
the Makoni clan is that when I'm in Zimbabwe, I get a feeling that I lose in their eyes all sense of my own individual identities. I'm their toy, right?
Mm.
The professor is back. It's not like they're interested in hearing what I have to say. It's like they need to show me off to to another client,
Ah.
right? So even if I want to go to see a friend here, they have a schedule set up for me ahead of time, and so it's an interesting thing because you get a sense that you are being fitted into a clan where you
Mm.
are the object that they need to show off. And so it's a funny thing. Anyway, let me stop there. Right.
Ah.
Amazing. I think there are a lot of people who want to talk about design, Sankofa, different methodologies, speculative methodologies, who want to ask more serious questions than the ones I was talking about, the two others.
I think your last question was pretty like the last. It's pretty. It's yeah. It's I guess it comes from a sense of the community, the Ubuntu, like where
Yes,
you are now
yes,
you are a person because you are part of us, and so we need to.
yes,
If you are successful, we need to show you off so that
yes.
we also getting the recognition.
Yes, that's the impression that I get.
Yeah.
That, oh yeah, we need to show you off to the professor is around. It's not so much what the professor says that is important for them.
Yeah,
And
because they are getting the reward as the community. They are because they are you are not just yourself. We are all you.
you're not just yourself. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, amazing. Let me hand over to amazing. I'm sure there are people who want to raise
If
questions.
you can put them in the chat box or use the raise hand button, and I'll call on you to ask. I have a question for you, Dr. Ofosu-Asare. So, having gone through your education, high school in visual arts, your first degree in graphic design, how do you view the education you had? And how do you think, if you were to go back into any African country, what would you do different as a teacher of graphic design or as a teacher of visual arts?
Uh, I think the education was sufficient. I think for what Ghana is where it is, I think it's a sufficient education that prepares you well for like what you need to know. I think it's more. I think that the changes are more identity related of who we are, where we are going, and where we find ourselves. I think that's where I think maybe changes. I think that then sits in the broader sense of everything we do. Because I think one big thing about the education system we have in Ghana is, or in Africa, is it takes you away from the community. It makes you an alien to the net. So this, I think Buzia talks about this, where you finish a typical school system in Ghana, and then you no longer are able to go back to your rural or your home and live with them because you've been trained to think differently. You learn to speak differently, and then you are no longer part of. So then for me, the my theory around this is part of the reason why corruption thrives because the person gets education, he get educated, he moves to the big city, he becomes a politician. He no longer has any obligation or anything linking him back to his hometown or his wherever he comes from. So it's like he detaches himself from his people. So if we're able to bridge fine. Like I think that like make sure you get an education, but you're still an African. You are not a colonial clerk anymore. You are not going to occupy because Fanon talks in the Wretched of the Head like this like the you finish school and you go and live in those colonial quarters the white people left. That's where they want to live. You no longer want to go back to your village and try and relate to people and be the person you were and trying to help them because so emotionally you just detach yourself. Even if you are corrupt, you don't care anymore because you feel like the people are somehow native. So you always hear the term the people, the Ghanaians, the Nigerians, as if they are not Nigerian or Ghanaian or themselves. It's like the Ghanaian is this stuff. Yeah. So I think that's where I see a lot of the tension happens. I think that's where identity, defining who we are and trying to make sure you finish your education, but you're still a big part of the community. The community, you are responsible for your community, and then you feel like you belong to that community.
Right. Thank you very much. Saligoko, you have a question, please. You can go ahead and ask.
I think you need to mute.
You're muted.
I have
I'll mute.
several questions or comments, but I'd like
Yeah.
to start by prefacing those comments with the following, that bringing philosophy into the discourse on decoloniality is a tremendous opportunity for us to ask ourselves some of the questions that we couldn't do. But before I get there, let me ask you if African philosophy is necessarily decolonial.
I think, yeah, that's a very interesting question. I've never thought about it. I think I've always assumed it's decolonial, but let me think about it more. I think it's a tool in our toolbox in part of decolonizing ourselves, and it's part of that.
Right.
It's a tool in a lot of tools we have in our box, so we can pick African philosophy and say, let's unpack who we are, let's unpack our like our identity, our epistemology. So then let's use African philosophy in doing that and understanding who we are.
Yeah. So I can reframe it this way. I'm Black African, grew up in Africa, but most of the academic training that shaped my professional life is Western based. So people can ask me whether I'm a linguist. People can ask me whether the kind of linguistics that I do is necessarily decolonial. And that takes a lot of research, criticism to answer, because there are things that I learned in my training that I have not necessarily jettisoned. They are part of the scholarship that I do. But there are also innovative aspects of my scholarship that can question the training that I received. And that's where I become decolonial. And that question, I think it applies also to African philosophy. But to answer it, I would like to complicate the subject matter. What is African philosophy? Is it Africans' approaches to philosophy, or philosophy as applied to African topics, or philosophy as people conceive of it in Africa? These are things that we have to clarify, and that applies to any kind of discipline. We speak of African linguistics. A lot of practitioners of African linguistics are not people of African descent. And they can also do very critical work in the discourse of decoloniality about what we call African linguistics. There are Africans that do linguistics that question many of the things that they have been taught, or the methodology that they have been taught about practicing linguistics and so forth. And they advocate for different kinds of approaches. But there are other Africans that are just choir boys and girls that feel comfortable in the established paradigm. And they produce more and more data that should apply to one classical interpretation, but doesn't question or doesn't deal with issues that may arise from the data that they are utilizing. So that's when I say the person is doing violence to the data and not giving enough voice to the data that contradict everything that you learn during your training, or most of what you learn in your training. So things become a little bit more difficult. But as I said in my preface, this is an opportunity for us to ask tough questions. And so that's why I wanted to ask you, what is African philosophy, knowing that there are ambiguities, but also as an invitation to specify your own conception of African linguistics and how your approach contributes to decoloniality. We saw interesting data and so forth, but these are things that must be clarified.
That's a loaded question. I don't know if it's a question, but for me,
It's a comment, maybe, because we
it's very
often
okay.
find ourselves in these traps. People invite you to talk about decoloniality, and then you start talking and you show in what way your work appears to be decolonial. But everything you say must be contextualized, or clarified against a particular backdrop of ideas and assumptions.
I think for me, where you talked about how people treat data, I think it's very important, where a lot of African scholarship seem not to be very contextualized to the culture, the socioeconomic. It's very, I guess, in our bid to rationalize knowledge and make sure we are rigor and the term scientific knowledge, we tend to forget. There's a lot of work around economic, social state where they seem to not use the lived experience of African as part of their whole data, as part of the method in getting to their data. So you get a lot of data coming off Africa, or the data then becomes part of policy, which never can then it never works in Africa because it never took into consideration the lived experience, the philosophy, how people relate to each other, the relational aspect of everything as part of the whole research process. So they finish and there's a lot of policies and things done in Africa, which doesn't, and language is also one big thing because when laws are debated and social discourses are done in English, neglecting a huge part of the citizenry who don't understand what is going on, and they became alienated just because of the language. People speak different languages. Like, okay, then I'm not part of this system. So how do I even be governed by this system where they are doing their own thing over there? I don't care. They are speaking their own good English. Why should I care? Why should I pay taxes anyways if I don't feel like the government relates to me? And that goes back to the education thing we talked about, where education alienates like the ruling class, the elite, like alienate a section part of the populace who govern us from the day-to-day, from like the people they are actually meant to govern. And I think the question about what is African philosophy, I think there's this book, A Companion on African Philosophy, which was co-edited by Kwesi Redu. And there's a lot of work which has been done in defining what actually African philosophy. I think there's a lot of disagree. Like as you said, I think he gave three questions or answers to what you think African philosophy should be. I think there's a lot of work that has gone into that area where a lot of people have talked about really, really gone into how you define African philosophy. So I think that's something, but I think it's mostly how that becomes embedded in method, embedded in how we go about doing research, we go about doing development work, how we go about, I think how we then pick that up. And then, because Western, like how we pick that up as part of our whole ethos of our lived experience. I think that's where maybe a lot of the gap exists. As in terms of the scholarship around African philosophy, it's been widely written since post-independent Africa. I think there's a
Yeah.
lot of scholarship that has gone in there. I think it's more to do with picking up, and I think it also goes in tandem with the history of Africa as we know. 50s to 60s, happy period, independence, everybody's happy. We get into the Cold War, we get into post-colonial, like where the wars, the coup d'etats that happened through the 70s, the 80s, and we come back in the 90s. So that's a lot of work where the most of the work done in the 60s, the 50s by Pan-African philosophers like Kwesi Redu, Frank Fanon, don't get used in the 70s and 80s. We just abandon them because we are now dealing with the harsh realities of the Cold War, the war, the coup d'etats. And then when we come back to the 90s, we start implementing the liberal democracy, the IMF comes in, sells, or like the socialism, like socialism doesn't work the way we thought it was going to work. And so now we have to then go back to what IMF tells us to do. And now I guess that becomes me as being born in that time and having experienced and then going, and now I think this is so much stability, a bit more stability. Expecting like an example, Ghana since '92 we've been having free, and then that affords you the time, the luxury to then go back and see what was written in the '50s and '60s and say, let's pick that up. And now here we are having this sort of conversation.
Yeah. Okay. I have a number of other comments, but I think Vanessa has been waiting.
Oh,
Mhm.
And I can come back later with my other comments.
Oh,
Yeah.
oh my. The digital discovery is just amazing when I think about my journey on the computer. It began when it was a room and it was just pages of output. It was simply bits. But then when I
mm,
looked at your diagnostic questions, they, I guess, spur me to really consider our virtual existence. I've been really taken over the past, I guess, 50 years at how much the things have changed online, and it's largely hearing you talk about design cues. It has to be largely based on design cues, and I hadn't thought about that because it is all images that we're seeing that seem to capture people's imagination the fastest and the best. Um, so one of the harsh realities of these constantly changing and adapting things is that colonialism is adapting, I think, as fast as we are pushing
mm,
decolonial theory. And for me, that's very overwhelming. You're not, you don't give up the ship. You keep pushing, but it certainly is very exhausting. Um, your question number 5 just exploded in me. How to build future that is rooted without becoming closed and open without becoming dependent. And that tied to your discussion of analytical resemblance versus rigor um, really struck me because to me it seems that analytical resemblance is critical to our continuing with the rigor. I don't see how we could separate the two, which brings me all the way back to what Sally Coco and you were talking about in terms of method as philosophy. Um, and I think of all this to wonder how I can get myself out of this. Um, it's like running around in a circle on the issue of coloniality. Um, I don't know if I'm making any sense or not. I'm so excited by what you're talking about, but design cues for me names it because so much has changed on the internet in the past 20 years that simply tells a completely different story and reinstitutes the difficulty of the colonial legacy.
yeah. Thank you so much for your, I think, design is it's playing a role, especially when it's really linked to marketing and making money and decision making,
Mhm.
cognitive. It really then pushes people to behave a certain way, exist in a certain way, and architect the spaces we exist in. All those things are really things that has been, and that comes from the university system where a lot of emphasis is built on branding, how to get people to make decisions, buy things, the labeling, the internet, like the corporation spends so much money on design research to make sure you are the design cued in a certain way where you are making certain decisions without even being aware. So and also I really like your point that colonialism is also like fighting like existing it's like this fight between colonialism and decolonialism. It's all happening and I think yeah, it's happening at the same time and it's I guess yeah, I really like that point. It's the world we are also in a very interesting time in the human history. So you could see all those things play out. There's so much information out there, and then so we see how the colonial powers are now even fighting among themselves, trying to see who is dominant and trying to play the game, the geopolitical system, like things happening right now. America, Europe, and now you could see them, the imperialness of them. Imperialism is basically coming back and how both of them are trying to context that contexted state of Greenland. And you could see how colonialism is shaping the conversation without even them being aware that Greenland itself is a colonial space and then
with
them trying to
colonialism being visual now. That's
yeah.
so overwhelming to me. I mean, it's just it multiplies exponentially in every direction. Because
Yeah.
one image, they used to say when we were kids, one image is worth 1,000 words or something like that. And we think
Mm.
about all the images that we've been hit with, and how they're shaping where we're thinking and the direction that we're going. It's a handful. It's a handful. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
Kathleen has a question. Storytelling as method has been used in different domains in the West, among other things in spatial planning, since we are discussing design. It is used for community engagement in order to understand the needs of the community and co-create shared visions, shape perceptions and belonging, and also to challenge dominant narratives. Case studies in spatial planning are available from, for example, Denmark and the Netherlands. I would like to understand how African storytelling as a method is different.
Um, I think African story is different. I think African story in itself, I guess if you look at examples like the Anansi story, how because of the deep oral traditions of like Africa, we tend because I remember like an example is when I was writing my PhD, my supervisor always says, just go straight to the point. And I was like, oh, I don't, why? It's just like, I just get writing, like write things and how we even talk, how we critique each other is it's in a story. People will tell you, people use a story to explain something to you. They could go straight to the point, but they will tell you a story just to get a point across or tell you a proverb just to unpack a whole system. So I think if we probably use those instead of just use those as a method, like in terms of the stories and understanding the stories behind, because the story behind everything we do, there's a story behind my name, there's a story behind every Adinkra symbol, there's a story, and then using them as more than just those motifs. I think that's why I talked about motifs and really using them as part of the whole design process. And really, it's sitting at the foundation of if you're designing a market, like how does the stories of the market shape the entire space you're designing for? And then I think and also, I guess it also goes back to the question of the philosophy, like stories, progress as like resources rather than philosophy and itself, and trying to challenge how those stories become. I think how I use stories in my storytelling in my work is not necessarily what the West does it. Because I come from using stories more to do with feeling rhythm, like how the students feel about the story, how does it change their typography choices, so it's very different. Yeah, so probably I don't I just yeah, maybe you could do an email exchange and talk about this thing more.
Okay. Grace Hampton has a question. Please, you can go ahead.
Am I?
Yes, Chris.
Yes, I'm trying. You can hear me?
Yes.
Yes, good. Okay. I am very impressed with the speaker's background and what you have been able to put into a design program. So after this session is over, if you can stay on a little bit, I want to talk with you about your philosophy and the curriculum you have developed. If I were to ask just one question about your presentation, I'm very interested in how you have retained a very basic African philosophy, because to my understanding and my experience is that philosophy is the basis for traditional African art, and how it influences contemporary. So I want to talk with you after this meeting about what you've done in the curriculum. But there was one comment that you made that I want you just to expand upon a little bit. And it was the notion of speculation as mirror. Or did I misinterpret that statement? Speculation.
No, it's
Okay. Can you amplify that and talk about that in terms of how you are building a curriculum that infuses and includes an African philosophy? And I was very interested too in all of the Western philosophy that you have been able to marry. So I'm very interested in what you're doing. Very few people have been able to melt that curriculum and those philosophies in the way you have. So that is a compliment I want to give you publicly.
Thank you.
Yeah, having been in the arts for a number of years and also being a visual artist, arts administration, and in central administration as well. So I'm looking at something that is just beautifully done. I must compliment you again on the melting, the blending of philosophy, of design ideas. I am impressed. So do talk to me after this meeting. All right?
I will. Yeah,
But my question was speculation as mirror and what that means in terms of your design concepts and your teaching.
Thank you so much for the compliment. I think thank you so much. As example I gave was how using the Martian colony, the curriculum built around Mars as like mirror. So then the student thinking about it's very speculative at the same time. It mirrors everything happening on Earth, and then really then looking at the speculation and then going with them on that 12-week journey for them to really understand how that mirrors whatever happening and then how they find themselves sitting in those tensions. So that how they find, because one of the beauty of the classrooms like we have at RMIT is there's a student from every part of the world. Unfortunately, not a lot from Africa, but like there's students, I've had students from Brunei, Nepal, Japan. So there's students everywhere. So them really coming here and really understanding that how do I where do I like just like a mirror. It's like looking into the like a speculative piece is presented to you, but at the same time, it mirrors your way of life, where you find yourself on Earth. I think that's where the idea comes from. And I'll quickly go back to the melting. I think something I didn't touch upon was last semester, I did a lot of experiment of using African philosophies in the classroom. So rearranging the classroom as a community, how tables were arranged, like having students sit in one big circle, having brown paper bags stapled on the wall as memory artifacts. So you come in class, you write your first couple of memories, you put it into a brown paper bag. After the whole semester, you pick it up and you go back and read. You see the difference between the first day you came to class where you put it in a paper bag and the last day you left, and like how you've understood like the journey you've been on. And then having and also having rhythm, a bit of music in class, a bit of having them to get up, talk to each other. So building those using how African, like how we live our life and trying to then bring it into a classroom of 20 students. So experimenting with those. I don't think I touched upon it, but like I've been trying different ways in which Sankofa is used, Ubuntu is used, Rhythm is used in the classroom.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
So if you can, please stay on and we need to chat afterwards. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Kathleen has a question. Isn't research itself, as it is currently understood in academia, a Western notion? To what extent can we dissociate from dominant discourses? Does everything need to be reconceptualized? Or is it possible to take what is relatable in Western thought and method and use it to develop a new paradigm? That's a question.
This is a debate I used to have with a lot of my colleagues when we were all writing PhD. I remember we would do midnight writing sessions, and then they'll it becomes an argument about subjectivity versus objectivity, and do we have to, like, how African can you, or how decolonized can you decolonize the PhD you're doing, since it comes from a very strong Western sense of writing a PhD, this scientific knowledge and problem, lit review, concept, theory, method, and then analysis. So what is the truth? I guess it comes from how do you write a whole thesis and tell me you are being objective, you are telling the truth? Like, where is you in the work? Like, you cannot separate yourself from the work, the PhD you are doing. You can't necessarily. For me, that's my take on it. And in terms of I don't think, for me, I think I do talk about this in my thesis. It's more to do with a third space. No, I think I also talked about it in the it's not being pure, like purity. We are not looking for a way to bring down all the West. Like, you can't do that. It's about how best to bring how the West meets against the global South, or whichever term you want. How do we bring those? And I think that's also talked about that, like, bring like a third space. How do you bring those things together? I think as someone who is in a decolonial space, I think it's upon you to think about how your work sits in between those two intersections. I think that's where the real decolonial happens. You finding a test space where your work sits in and really challenging and saying, I'm picking this from the West, I'm bringing this from Africa, or India, or wherever you find yourself. And then what is the knowledge I'm creating? I have these two experiences. How do I bring a test? How do I create a test? So I guess you could say a reconceptualization of the whole thing of research.
Thank you very much. Kathleen, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. It appears to me that a lot of decolonizing is happening in the West, and if it's by African scholars and others, it is signifying to the West. what is actually happening in Africa? If we are talking about, decolonizing African thought, decolonizing whatever we can decolonize. So what is happening in Africa itself?
I think you need to understand Africa in the context of pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial. I think I always tend to tell whenever we have a discussion with my friends, like Africa in its post-colonial border system is a very new. All the countries there are less than sub-Saharan Africa, less than 67 years. So still a very new. It's an old place. People have lived, but like it's in terms of modern geopolitical borders, it's still very new. So a lot is happening in Africa. A lot of people are doing a lot of amazing work in Africa. All the knowledge being shared here, all the books. Like you go in Ghana, there's this thing about Dirty December. There's a lot happening in our school system. There's a lot happening in curriculum changes. There's a whole lot happening. People rediscovering. It's like even with social media, people are rediscovering themselves. They rediscovering who they are as African. Really, and we are retelling our story. 67 years in a continent or a country's history is not a long time. It's very, very young. 67 it's like a baby. So in terms of that, and whilst we are in the West talking about decolonial, it may seem like I don't know if your question means we should be having the discussions in Africa rather than being in the West and talking about it. I don't think probably I don't think it's fair to say that, because it's like there's also economic realities, the social realities we all face. I think we wish we were in Africa. We wish these conversations were happening in Africa, but for reasons we are aware as Africans, we can't have those privileges to have those conversations in Africa. Whilst it's being had in Africa, we've had like this from like our friends in Ghana who are doing amazing work in the spaces they find themselves. And trust me, there's so much happening. I can't even keep up, and sometimes I have a lot of FOMO of missing out on the things happening there. Because it's such a young continent. There's so many. It's things are moving really fast. So for me, it's there's a lot happening. A lot has been happening since this post-independence. That's from Ghana has gone through like 5 or 7 education iterations. We've changed economic from socialism to capitalism so many times. We've been trying so many ways to really decolonize. It just didn't start. Africa has been trying to decolonize since coming from a new colonialism. We've been talking about this for forever. It's just unfortunate. Like it's not unfortunate that history hasn't been fair to us, but we are still on the journey. And yeah, so if we find ourselves here talking about decolonization, it doesn't mean we've forgotten about where we come from. We are just here romanticizing the idea of decolonization while we sit in the comfort of the West. This is knowledge sharing. We are still working. It's all part of it. So.
All right. Eric has a question. Is African philosophy meta-knowledge or what exists? In other words, is it possible for a reputable, uneducated African talk of an African philosophy?
Uneducated. I guess Sally Coco define, I think the term is African philosophy, the way of living. I think you really termed it very well. I think we always philosophize, and Africans are always coming up with the new proverbs, the music we do, the Afrobeat. These are all philosophy, like a way, the lyrics and everything is weird. So I think maybe let me go back to the question. Uneducated African talk to is philosophy a meta knowledge or what exists? In other words, is it possible for a repeatable? It's a very interesting use of language, repeatable, uneducated African talk of an African philosophy. What does that mean, like repeatable, uneducated African?
Eric.
It's a very interesting use of language.
Yes, I'm right. I'm right
Uneducated.
here.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Eric.
I
Yeah.
want to look at this discussion about Ubuntu, about an African, let me say a successful African, in a
Yeah.
community who's not as an individual, but carrying the values of the community. Okay.
Mm,
Let's say I'm one and my community recognizes me for the things that I have done, but not because of education. Because what we call today education is a discourse of Western philosophy.
mm,
I mean, in terms of what we call universality, education
yeah.
excludes the other knowledges. Okay. This African who is well known, maybe for advancing a lot of knowledge within an African community, but is not educated according to the Western definition of education. Is it possible for that person to talk about African philosophy?
Yeah, I get your point. I think you also need to understand that like the word African philosophy is English. It's two English words joined together. So philosophy itself is an English. We're trying to define a set of how we live our lives, and so I think it not necessary. You don't need a degree to, because one of the things I love about listening to people talk, like going to linguist talk or listening to people talk in Ghana or Africa, just listen to them talk in proverbs, how people talk and how people come up with knowledge and how people define knowledge. I think it's so beautiful. The stories people tell, how people communicate. I don't think you necessarily need to have as you said, formal like education as we know the formal education system we have is just a Western. It's just work, finish, go work in a factory, follow order, don't question anything, just work, 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 work. That's how I educate. So I don't think you need. I don't think African philosophy belongs to any set of people who've gone through the school system. I think it's an embodied way of living where people live through it, live with it, and live for it. I think maybe that's one of the uniqueness of African philosophy, where it's such an embodied thing where we actually live it. It's your lived experience. It's your day to day. As I talk about my name, like all these things are parts. The drums, the talking drums and everything, they are all part of the resources we have in philosophy. So people are always philosophizing, I guess.
So it would appear the concept of African philosophy is the outcome of this embodied way of life or education.
Yeah, so this is where people have conceptual, so this embodied is where we get all the philosophies we have, because people live the life, get documented in oral traditions, and then you pick it up as the philosophies.
Thank you.
I think
Welcome.
to the unmoderated session now, so I'll stop recording. It's the after party. You can feel free to talk about anything, discuss anything.